The polar vortex is a massive, swirling ring of extremely cold air that sits high up in the atmosphere. Imagine a giant, invisible barrier of icy wind circling the very top and bottom of our planet. This powerful system is one of the most important features of Earth's weather, especially during the winter months. This ring of frigid air constantly moves around both the North and South poles, acting like a protective shield that keeps the coldest air trapped near the poles most of the time. The polar vortex is always present, but it becomes much stronger and more noticeable during the winter. The air inside the vortex is not just cold, it's some of the coldest air on Earth. It spins rapidly, almost like a giant top, creating a swirling motion that can be seen from space. This spinning helps keep the cold air locked in place, high above the ground. When you hear news reports about the polar vortex, it usually means that this icy air has escaped its usual home and is heading toward places where people live. That's when we experience those bone-chilling, super cold days that make winter feel especially harsh. Most of the time, the polar vortex stays stable and circles quietly above the poles, far away from most cities and towns. It acts like a cold air reservoir, rarely bothering people living farther south. But sometimes, the vortex weakens or splits apart. When this happens, huge masses of cold air can spill out and travel southward, reaching areas that are usually much warmer. This sudden movement can bring dramatic changes in temperature, catching many people by surprise. When the polar vortex escapes its usual boundaries, it can cause sudden and severe cold snaps. Temperatures can drop rapidly, making it much colder than normal for days or even weeks. These events can disrupt daily life, close schools, and make travel dangerous. The polar vortex is just one part of our planet's complex weather system. It interacts with other weather patterns, like jet streams and ocean currents, to shape the climate we experience all over the world. Understanding how the polar vortex works helps us see the bigger picture of Earth's changing weather. The word vortex means something spinning in a circle, like water swirling down a drain or a tornado twisting through the sky. In the case of the polar vortex, it's cold air spinning in a huge circle near the poles, high above the ground. So, when we talk about the polar vortex, we're really talking about this massive spinning pool of icy air that circles the poles and sometimes sends waves of cold weather far to the south. When the vortex breaks apart or shifts, it can travel south and cause big changes in weather, bringing freezing temperatures, snowstorms, and even record-breaking cold to places that aren't used to such extreme conditions. Learning about the polar vortex helps us understand why winter can sometimes feel so much colder than usual. It explains those sudden cold snaps and helps us prepare for the challenges of winter weather. Meteorologists and scientists study the polar vortex closely, using satellites and weather models to predict when and where it might affect our weather. By understanding the polar vortex, they can give us early warnings and help keep us safe during extreme winter events. The polar vortex is a fascinating and powerful force of nature that lives high up in the sky, far above the surface of the Earth where we live our daily lives. It exists in the uppermost layers of the atmosphere, in a region called the stratosphere, which is much higher than where clouds form or birds fly. In fact, the polar vortex is found far above where even airplanes fly. Commercial jets usually cruise at around 35,000 feet, but the polar vortex swirls even higher, sometimes reaching altitudes of 50,000 feet or more. There are actually two polar vortices on our planet, one over the Arctic at the North Pole and another over Antarctica at the South Pole. These swirling masses of cold air are a permanent feature of Earth's weather system, always present but sometimes stronger or weaker depending on the season. The air inside the vortex is much colder than the air outside. In fact, temperatures inside the polar vortex can plunge to minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit or even lower, making it one of the coldest places on Earth. The vortex acts like a giant, invisible wall of wind, spinning rapidly around the pole. This wall is not something you can see with your eyes, but satellites and weather instruments can track its powerful movement. Most of the time, this swirling wall keeps the coldest air locked close to the pole, preventing it from spilling out into lower latitudes where most people live. The wall is created by a band of fast-moving air called the jet stream. The jet stream acts like a barrier, racing around the top of the world at speeds that can reach over 200 miles per hour. The jet stream is constantly in motion, circling the globe and helping to shape weather patterns far below. It's one of the most important features in our atmosphere, guiding storms and influencing temperatures across continents. When the polar vortex is strong, It forms a tight, well-defined circle around the pole. This keeps the coldest air trapped in the far north or south, away from cities and towns. As a result, the coldest air stays confined to the polar regions, and most people in the world don't feel its effects. But sometimes the polar vortex weakens or becomes unstable. When this happens, the wall of wind breaks down, and cold air can slip out, spilling southward into North America, Europe, or Asia. This is when we experience sudden cold snaps or extreme winter weather. So, while the polar vortex is always present high above the Earth, we only really notice it when it shifts or moves, sending waves of frigid air far from the poles. That's when the polar vortex makes headlines, when it escapes its usual boundaries and brings bitter cold, snow, and ice to places that aren't used to such extreme winter conditions. The next time you hear about a polar vortex, you'll know it's a powerful force swirling high above, shaping the weather we feel on the ground. The polar vortex is not something you can see with your eyes. If you were to stand at the North Pole and look up at the sky, you wouldn't spot a swirling cloud or a giant storm. Instead, you'd see a cold, empty landscape and a sky that looks just like any other winter day. The polar vortex is invisible to us because it is made up of air, not something solid or even cloudy that we can see. It is made of air, not clouds or snow. The air in the polar vortex is extremely cold and moves in a huge circle high above the ground, but it doesn't form visible shapes like clouds do. You might feel the effects of the polar vortex as icy winds or freezing temperatures, but you can't actually see the vortex itself with your eyes. But satellites can see the polar vortex by looking at the swirling air above the pole. Special instruments on satellites track the movement of air and temperature patterns, revealing the giant spinning system that circles the Arctic. These images show the polar vortex as a massive swirl, almost like a hurricane made of cold air, stretching over the top of the world. If you could see it, the polar vortex would look like a giant spinning wheel of wind. Imagine a huge, invisible pinwheel turning slowly above the North Pole, with icy air whipping around in a circle. This spinning motion helps keep the coldest air trapped near the pole, acting like a barrier that separates the frigid Arctic from warmer southern regions. It can stretch for thousands of miles. The polar vortex isn't just a small patch of wind. It can cover the entire Arctic region and sometimes even reach down into parts of North America, Europe, and Asia. When it expands, it can bring extremely cold weather far from the pole. Sometimes it looks smooth and round, and sometimes it gets wobbly or even breaks apart. When the vortex is strong, it forms a tight, circular shape. But when it weakens, it can become stretched and distorted, sending fingers of cold air down into lower latitudes. This is when you might hear about polar vortex outbreaks, bringing sudden cold snaps to places that are usually much warmer. The shape of the polar vortex changes with the seasons. In the winter, the vortex becomes larger and more powerful, spinning faster and holding more cold air. In the summer, it shrinks and weakens, allowing warmer air to move closer to the pole. In the winter, it gets bigger and stronger. The cold, dark months allow the vortex to tighten up and spin faster, creating a more defined and powerful system. This is when the polar vortex is at its most impressive, sometimes sending blasts of Arctic air far to the south. In the summer, it gets smaller and weaker. As sunlight returns to the Arctic and temperatures rise, the vortex loses strength and becomes less organized. The boundary between cold and warm air becomes blurrier, and the vortex can even break apart completely for a time. The jet stream helps shape the vortex by blowing around it. The jet stream is a fast-moving river of air high in the atmosphere, and it acts like a fence, guiding and sometimes distorting the edges of the polar vortex. When the jet stream dips or bends, it can pull cold air out of the vortex and send it south, causing dramatic changes in weather. The polar vortex is always moving and changing. It shifts, stretches, and sometimes splits into smaller pieces, depending on the weather patterns around the world. This constant motion means that the polar vortex never looks exactly the same from one day to the next. That is why weather near the poles can be so different from year to year. Some winters, the vortex stays strong and keeps the cold locked up north. Other years, it weakens and lets icy air escape, bringing unusual cold to places far from the Arctic. The polar vortex is a powerful force shaping our planet's weather, even if we can't see it with our own eyes. The polar vortex keeps the coldest air near the poles. When it is strong, winter is normal in places like the United States or Europe. But when the vortex gets weak or wobbly, cold air can rush down to where many people live. This is when we feel cold snaps or Arctic blasts. These are times when the temperature drops quickly and it gets very cold. Sometimes, snowstorms and icy winds come with the polar vortex. Not every winter has a polar vortex event. But when it happens, it can set new records for cold. People need to wear warm clothes and stay safe from frostbite. The polar vortex is like a giant freezer opening up and letting all the cold out. That is why learning about it helps us get ready for winter. So the polar vortex can actually be pushed around by other winds. Sometimes warm air from below pushes up toward the pole, and this can break the vortex apart and make it move. Big storms over the ocean or changes in the jet stream can also make the vortex wobble. When the wall of wind gets weak, cold air can escape. This is when the vortex moves south. Scientists call this polar vortex disruption. It's kind of like someone bumping a spinning top and making it wobble. When this happens, the cold air spreads out over new places. These changes don't happen every year, but when they do, they can really surprise people with sudden cold weather. When the polar vortex moves south, it brings very cold air to places that are usually warmer. Cities in the United States, Europe, or Asia can suddenly feel like the North Pole. This can make winter storms stronger. Snow can fall in places that hardly ever see it. Water pipes can freeze, and roads can get very icy. Schools and businesses might close to keep people safe. People need to dress warmly and stay indoors as much as possible. Cars might not start, and pets need extra care. Even birds and animals in nature have to find shelter from the cold. A moving polar vortex is a big deal. It can change the lives of millions of people for days or even weeks. In 2014, a very strong polar vortex moved over the United States. It brought freezing air all the way to Florida and Texas. Some places had the coldest weather in 100 years. People called it the polar vortex winter. In 2019, another polar vortex hit the Midwest. Cities like Chicago saw temperatures colder than parts of Antarctica. Trains had to use fire to keep the tracks from freezing. Other big polar vortex events have happened in Europe and Asia. In 2012, Moscow had one of its coldest winters in a long time. In 2021, Texas had a rare snowstorm and lost power because of freezing weather. These events show how powerful the polar vortex can be. It can change weather all over the world. When the polar vortex hits, people have to be careful. Frostbite and hypothermia can happen fast. Hospitals get more calls for help, and energy use goes up as people heat their homes. Nature gets a shock too. Animals search for food and shelter. Some birds fly south to escape the cold. Plants can freeze if the cold lasts too long. Even lakes and rivers can freeze over. Farmers can lose crops, and animals can struggle to find food. Pets and farm animals need extra care to stay warm. Cold snaps also affect trees, as some may lose branches from heavy snow or ice. The polar vortex reminds us that we share our planet with powerful forces. Being ready helps people and nature stay safe. Here's a fun fact. The polar vortex is not new. It has been spinning above the poles for millions of years. Scientists only gave it this name in the 1950s. Today, with satellite pictures and computer models, we can watch the polar vortex every day. This helps us get ready for wild weather. The more we learn, the better we can protect ourselves. Remember, the polar vortex is just part of how Earth moves heat and cold around. It is amazing to think about all the invisible forces at work above our heads. So next time you hear about a polar vortex on the news, you'll know what it means and how to stay safe and warm.